Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that sounds completely made up but isn't. A court jester told one joke at dinner and accidentally started a war. Why? In a couple of minutes, you'll find out how these dinner comedians became some of the most influential and dangerous people in the empire. By the end of this video, you'll understand why sultans were willing to pay fortunes for the right punchline and how a well-timed joke could literally change the course of history. Here's what makes this story wild. Ottoman sultans controlled territories spanning 3 continents, commanded armies of hundreds of thousands, and lived in palaces that made Versailles look like a suburban McMansion. But here's the contrast that breaks your expectations. These same almighty rulers were so desperate for genuine human connection and stress relief that they created an entire profession dedicated to making them laugh during dinner. You probably won't survive the psychological pressure these comedians faced, knowing that a poorly received joke could mean losing your head, literally. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the shadow of the Topkapi Palace in 1520, watching as the sun sets over the Bosphorus. The call to prayer echoes across Istanbul's 7 hills, while inside the palace walls, something extraordinary is happening. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of an empire stretching from Hungary to Yemen, is getting ready for dinner, but not the kind of dinner you'd expect. The palace kitchens are bustling with activity as hundreds of cooks prepare elaborate dishes. Roasted lamb stuffed with rice and almonds, honey-soaked pastries, and exotic fruits from every corner of the empire fill golden platters. But there's something else being prepared with equal care, entertainment that goes far beyond simple musical accompaniment. You see, the Ottoman dinner experience wasn't just about food. It was theater, politics, and psychological warfare, all rolled into one carefully orchestrated event. And at the center of it all stood figures who seem almost mythical today, professional joke tellers whose job was to make the Sultan laugh while navigating the deadliest social minefield in the known world. Picture this. While European kings were content with simple minstrels strumming lutes, Ottoman sultans demanded comedy that could make them forget the weight of ruling 30 million subjects. The dinner hall itself was a stage, massive chambers with soaring domed ceilings, walls covered in hand-painted tiles depicting paradise, and windows overlooking the Golden Horn where ships from Venice, Genoa, and Alexandria waited to unload their treasures. This tradition didn't emerge overnight. The roots of Ottoman court comedy stretch back to ancient Persia, where the Sassanid kings first employed court entertainers called matreb, who combined music, storytelling, and humor. These Persian entertainers weren't just performers. They were cultural ambassadors who could speak multiple languages, understand complex theological debates, and navigate the intricate politics of royal courts. When the Arabs conquered Persia in the 7th century, they absorbed these entertainment traditions, refining them in the courts of Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate. The transformation was remarkable. What had been primarily musical entertainment evolved into sophisticated verbal comedy that could comment on everything from trade policies to religious debates. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, famous from the Arabian Nights tales, maintained an entire troupe of court jesters who performed during his legendary dinner parties. These weren't just random clowns. They were highly educated individuals who could recite poetry in 7 languages, debate philosophy with visiting scholars, and deliver cutting social commentary through the safe vehicle of humor. Some possessed photographic memories, able to recall and mimic conversations from months earlier, turning private discussions into public entertainment. As the Ottoman Empire expanded and absorbed these cultural traditions, they didn't just copy what came before. They created something entirely new, a sophisticated system of court entertainment that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Entertainment, yes, but also intelligence gathering, political messaging, and psychological therapy for rulers carrying unimaginable burdens. The Ottoman approach was methodical in a way that would impress modern corporate HR departments. They established formal ranks within the entertainment hierarchy, created apprenticeship programs for aspiring comedians, and even developed standardized payment scales based on performance quality and audience reaction. The most successful joke tellers earned salaries equivalent to provincial governors. That's serious money in an empire where a good horse cost more than most people made in a year. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman approach to court comedy was more sophisticated than its Persian and Arab predecessors, but one thing is undeniable. They turned it into an art form that influenced entertainment culture across 3 continents for over 6 centuries. Some scholars suggest the Ottoman system was so advanced that it influenced the development of European court entertainment, though European nobles were typically too proud to admit borrowing from their Eastern rivals. What makes this story particularly fascinating is how these dinner comedians operated in a world where the wrong word could mean death, yet somehow managed to speak truths that no one else dared voice. They walked a tightrope between entertainment and sedition, between making the Sultan laugh and making him think. The skill required was extraordinary. Imagine trying to make jokes about tax collection while the finance minister sits 3 feet away, or commenting on military strategy while surrounded by generals who have lost battles. The palace records from this era reveal something remarkable. Sultans often spent more on their dinner entertainment budget than on their military campaigns. That's right, they valued good jokes more than good swords, at least when it came to their personal comfort and mental health. Sultan Murad IV, known for his military conquests, you're witnessing the birth of something revolutionary in medieval entertainment, the meta system, where storytelling evolved into a sophisticated art form that would make modern stand-up comedians weep with envy. These weren't your typical court jesters juggling balls and making funny faces. The meta were intellectual athletes who could seamlessly blend comedy, social commentary, and theatrical performance into a single, mesmerizing dinner show. The word meta literally means one who praises, but that's like calling Shakespeare someone who writes. These performers were human chameleons who could shift between characters mid-sentence, delivering different voices, accents, and personalities with such precision that audiences forgot they were watching a single person. Imagine someone doing impressions of every person at your dinner table while telling a story that somehow manages to insult your enemies and flatter your friends, all without you being entirely sure which is which. What made the meta system unique was its structure. Unlike European court entertainers who typically specialized in one skill, music, acrobatics, or simple comedy, Ottoman meta were required to master what they called the 7 arts of entertainment: poetry recitation, character impressions, musical accompaniment, storytelling, improvised comedy, social commentary, and what they termed mirror speech, the ability to reflect the Sultan's own thoughts and concerns back to him through seemingly innocent stories. The training process was brutal and could take decades. Aspiring meta began as children, often orphans taken in by established performers who saw potential in their quick wit or natural charisma. They spent years memorizing thousands of traditional stories, learning to play at least 3 musical instruments, and developing the physical stamina needed to perform for hours without losing energy or focus. But here's where it gets really interesting and dangerous. The most successful meta weren't just entertainers, they were essentially unlicensed therapists for the most powerful men on Earth. They learned to read the Sultan's mood from the slightest facial expression, adjusting their performance in real time to provide exactly what their audience needed. Stressed about military campaigns. The meta would tell stories of great generals who overcame impossible odds. Worried about succession politics, they'd weave tales of wise rulers who handled family disputes with cunning and grace. The performance space itself was carefully designed to maximize the meta's impact. They typically stood in the center of the dining hall, surrounded by the Sultan and his guests, with no stage or barrier between performer and audience. This intimate setting meant every gesture, every facial expression, every pause for effect was magnified. There was nowhere to hide, no curtain to retreat behind if a joke fell flat or a story took an uncomfortable turn. One particularly famous meta named Hasavat developed a technique called the mirror method, where he would subtly imitate the mannerisms and speech patterns of dinner guests while telling stories about fictional characters. The guests would recognize themselves in the performance without being directly mocked, creating a strange intimacy that was both flattering and slightly unsettling. Historians still argue whether this technique was pure entertainment or a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation designed to make the Sultan's guests more compliant and predictable. The most skilled meta could perform what they called the living newspaper, taking current events and political developments, then transforming them into entertaining stories that helped the Sultan process complex information while relaxing. They were essentially the world's first political comedy shows, centuries before Saturday Night Live made the concept mainstream. What's particularly fascinating is how the meta navigated religious sensitivities. The Ottoman Empire was officially Islamic, but the Sultan's dinner guests often included Christian merchants, Jewish financiers, and diplomats from various faiths. The meta developed a sophisticated system of coded language and universal themes that could entertain diverse audiences without offending anyone's religious beliefs, no small feat in an era when religious tensions could spark international incidents. The economics of this profession were surprisingly complex. While the most successful meta earned substantial salaries, they also operated within an intricate gift economy. Pleased dinner guests would shower performers with gold coins, jeweled daggers, or valuable silk robes during particularly impressive performances. Some meta accumulated enough wealth to purchase their own homes and even employ servants, creating a strange social dynamic where former slaves or orphans could achieve higher living standards than minor nobility. But the flip side was constant insecurity. A meta's fortune could evaporate overnight if they misread the political climate or accidentally offended the wrong person. Palace records reveal stories of once celebrated performers who vanished from court life after a single poorly timed joke, their names literally erased from official entertainment rosters as if they had never existed. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine spending your entire career walking on intellectual eggshells, knowing that your livelihood and potentially your life depended on reading the room perfectly every single night. Many meta developed what palace physicians called performer's melancholy, a condition remarkably similar to what we now recognize as chronic anxiety and depression. Yet they persisted, driven by the intoxicating combination of wealth, influence, and the addictive rush of making the most powerful people in the world laugh. Some meta became so integral to palace life that sultans would postpone important dinners if their favorite performer was ill. Sultan Ahmed III reportedly delayed a crucial diplomatic meeting with Venetian ambassadors for 3 days because his preferred meta had lost his voice, and the Sultan refused to conduct important business without proper entertainment. The meta system also created an informal intelligence network that spanned the empire. Traveling performers would carry news, gossip, and cultural trends between different regions, effectively serving as the Ottoman Empire's entertainment-based communication system. A joke that killed in Damascus might make its way to Istanbul within months, while a story that flopped in Baghdad could be refined and adapted for different audiences across the empire. This cultural exchange was so effective that some historians argue the Meta network contributed more to Ottoman cultural unity than official government policies. When people across the empire were laughing at the same jokes and enjoying variations of the same stories, it created a shared cultural experience that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The legacy of these performers extends far beyond entertainment. Modern Turkish shadow puppet theater, traditional storytelling techniques, and even contemporary political satire can trace their roots back to the innovations pioneered by Ottoman Meta. They essentially invented the You step deeper into the palace hierarchy and discover something that would make modern corporate ladder climbers dizzy with envy. The Ottoman entertainment system was more stratified than a medieval feudal court, with each level of performer knowing exactly where they stood in the cosmic order of making the Sultan smile. At the bottom of this entertainment pyramid sat the basic musicians, or seizend, who were essentially human background music. These poor souls stood against the walls during dinner, playing lutes and flutes while praying nobody would notice them enough to either praise or punish their performance. They earned barely enough to afford decent clothes and lived in cramped quarters near the palace kitchens, close enough to smell the royal feast but far enough to know they'd never taste it. One rung up were the dancers and acrobats, the rakes, who provided visual spectacle between courses. While more noticeable than the musicians, they were still considered replaceable entertainment, impressive to watch but hardly essential to the Sultan's well-being. Think of them as the Ottoman equivalent of halftime show performers, skilled, athletic, but ultimately forgettable once the main event resumed. Then came the storytellers, or hikayesi, who occupied a curious middle ground in this hierarchy. They weren't quite comedians, but weren't simple musicians either. These performers specialized in recounting epic tales, historical adventures, and romantic sagas that could stretch across multiple dinner courses. The best hikayesi could gauge exactly how long the Sultan wanted to linger over his wine and adjust their stories accordingly, stretching a 20-minute tale into an hour-long epic or condensing a complex saga into a brief intermission between dishes. But here's where the hierarchy gets interesting and cutthroat. Above the storytellers sat the impressionists, or taklitsi, who specialized in mimicking famous people, from rival sultans to pompous diplomats to merchant princes who thought too highly of themselves. These performers walked a particularly dangerous tightrope because their art involved making fun of real people, some of whom might be sitting in the same room or could hear about the performance through the palace gossip network. The taklitsi developed an elaborate system of coded performances where they could mock someone without technically naming them. They'd adopt a person's distinctive speech patterns, mannerisms, and verbal tics while supposedly portraying a fictional character. Everyone in the room would know exactly who was being lampooned, but the performer maintained plausible deniability. "Oh, that wasn't the Venetian ambassador I was imitating, Your Majesty, just a generic Italian merchant character I invented." Near the top of this entertainment food chain sat the pure comedians, the latifsi, who specialized in original jokes, witty observations, and spontaneous humor. These were the performers who could think on their feet, responding to unexpected events during dinner with perfectly timed quips that would have the entire room roaring with laughter. They were essentially the Ottoman equivalent of modern improv comedians, except the stakes were infinitely higher. The latifsi operated under what palace insiders called the three-strike rule, though nobody ever explained this to the performers themselves. 3 failed jokes in a single evening meant demotion to a lower entertainment rank. 3 successful evenings in a row could mean promotion and a salary increase, but 3 offensive jokes, even spread across months, could mean permanent banishment from court or worse. Historians still argue whether this ranking system was formal policy or simply evolved naturally from palace culture, but the evidence suggests it was surprisingly official. Palace records include detailed salary scales, performance evaluations, and even what appear to be primitive audience feedback surveys where dinner guests would rate entertainers on categories like wit, timing, appropriateness, and overall contribution to His Majesty's enjoyment. At the absolute pinnacle of this hierarchy stood the Nedim, the imperial jester, a position so exclusive that most sultans employed only 1 or 2 at a time. The Nedim wasn't just an entertainer, he was essentially a licensed truth-teller who could say things to the sultan that would get anyone else executed. This wasn't just about comedy, it was about providing the ruler with unfiltered feedback wrapped in humor. The Nedim earned a salary equivalent to high-ranking government officials and enjoyed privileges that made provincial governors jealous. They could interrupt the sultan mid-sentence if they had a particularly good joke. They could mock government policies, criticize military strategies, and even comment on the sultan's personal habits, all under the protective umbrella of entertainment. But with great power came terrifying responsibility. The Nedim was expected to be on constantly, ready to diffuse tension with humor, lighten dark moods with wit, and provide comic relief during the most stressful moments of imperial decision-making. They became so integral to palace life that some sultans would consult their Nedim about important decisions, not for political advice, but to gauge how their policies might be received by the common people. The competition for these top positions was brutal and often literally deadly. Aspiring entertainers would spend years working their way up the hierarchy, perfecting their craft while eliminating rivals through superior performance, or occasionally through more direct methods. Palace chronicles hint at mysterious disappearances of promising comedians who got too close to challenging the reigning Nedim's position. What made this system particularly fascinating was its meritocratic elements. Unlike other palace positions that might depend on family connections or political alliances, entertainment rankings were based purely on performance. You're about to discover something that would make modern stress management consultants weep with professional jealousy. Ottoman court physicians literally prescribed laughter as medicine, and sultans treated their dinner comedians like therapeutic necessities rather than mere entertainment luxuries. The Ottoman medical system, heavily influenced by Islamic scholar Ibn Sina's teachings, recognized what we now call psychosomatic medicine centuries before Western doctors caught on. Palace physicians, known as hekimbashi, maintained detailed records of how different types of entertainment affected the sultan's health, sleep patterns, and decision-making abilities. They noticed that rulers who laughed regularly during dinner showed better digestion, sounder sleep, and more balanced judgment in morning administrative meetings. But here's the fascinating part. They didn't just observe these effects, they actively prescribed specific types of humor for different ailments. Feeling melancholy, the hekimbashi would recommend witty wordplay and clever observations. Stressed about military campaigns, time for stories about bumbling generals and cowardly soldiers, worried about palace intrigue. Nothing like jokes about paranoid rulers who saw conspiracies everywhere. The irony was apparently lost on the sultans themselves. The psychological pressure of ruling an empire spanning 3 continents was literally killing these men. Sultan Murad IV, despite being known for his physical strength and military prowess, suffered from what palace records describe as night terrors and stomach fire, symptoms we now recognize as severe anxiety and stress-induced digestive problems. His personal physician prescribed daily doses of comedy, specifically requesting performers who could make the Sultan laugh until his sides hurt, believing that physical laughter could counteract the physical symptoms of psychological stress. What's particularly interesting is how sophisticated their understanding of comedy therapy became. Palace physicians developed what they called humor mapping, detailed charts showing which types of jokes worked best for different emotional states. They discovered that self-deprecating humor helped egotistical sultans maintain perspective, while clever wordplay stimulated intellectual engagement during periods of mental fog caused by stress. The therapeutic benefits weren't just psychological, they were measurably physical. Court records describe how Sultan Ahmed I's chronic headaches disappeared after he began hosting nightly comedy sessions during dinner. His physician noted that laughter seemed to release the bad vapors from his head and improve his overall constitution. While their understanding of the mechanism was primitive, they were essentially documenting the physiological effects of endorphin release and stress hormone reduction. But the most remarkable aspect of this system was how it addressed the profound isolation of absolute power. Imagine being so powerful that everyone around you is either terrified of you, trying to manipulate you, or both. The psychological loneliness of sultanship was crushing. These men were surrounded by thousands of people, yet had virtually no genuine human connections. The dinner comedians served as a bridge to authentic human interaction. They were perhaps the only people in the palace who could treat the Sultan like a regular person, at least for a few hours each evening. When a Nedim made fun of the Sultan's eating habits or gently mocked his fashion choices, it provided a precious moment of normalcy in an otherwise surreal existence. Historians still argue whether this therapeutic approach was consciously developed or evolved naturally from palace culture, but the evidence suggests it was surprisingly systematic. Palace libraries contained detailed treatises on the medical benefits of controlled laughter and the proper dosage of humor for melancholic temperaments. These weren't just entertainment guides, they were medical textbooks disguised as comedy manuals. The effectiveness of this system is documented in palace chronicles that track the mental health and decision-making quality of different sultans. Rulers who maintained regular comedy sessions showed markedly better judgment in political matters, less erratic behavior in personal relationships, and longer lifespans compared to those who neglected their entertainment therapy. Sultan Sulayman the Magnificent, widely considered the most successful Ottoman ruler, maintained an elaborate schedule of comedic entertainment that his physicians considered essential to his mental health. His personal Nedim, a former slave named Haridin, became so crucial to the Sultan's well-being that he was assigned his own security detail, not to protect him from enemies, but to ensure he remained healthy enough to perform his therapeutic duties. The system even included what we might now recognize as group therapy sessions. Some dinner comedians specialized in performances that encouraged the Sultan and his advisors to laugh together, creating shared emotional experiences that improved communication and cooperation in government meetings. These performers were essentially facilitating team-building exercises through humor, centuries before corporate consultants made it a profitable industry. What's particularly striking is how this approach recognized the bidirectional nature of the performer-audience relationship. The comedians weren't just providing therapy, they were receiving it too. Many palace records describe how performers found their own stress and anxiety reduced through the act of making others laugh, creating a You're witnessing something that would make modern political satirists green with envy. A system where court jesters could openly mock government policies, criticize military strategies, and even lampoon the Sultan's personal enemies, all while providing the ruler with perfect plausible deniability if things went sideways. This wasn't accidental. The Ottoman political system was sophisticated enough to recognize that absolute power creates dangerous information bubbles. When everyone around you is either afraid to speak honestly or actively trying to deceive you, how do you know what's really happening in your empire? The solution was brilliant in its simplicity: create a class of people whose job was to tell the truth through jokes. The concept worked on multiple levels simultaneously. First, it gave sultans access to unfiltered information about public opinion. When a court jester made jokes about corrupt tax collectors, he wasn't just being funny. He was reporting intelligence about administrative problems that might not appear in official reports. Palace records show that sultans often used comedy sessions as informal intelligence briefings, paying close attention to which jokes got the biggest laughs and what those reactions revealed about underlying political tensions. But here's where it gets really clever. Because the criticism came wrapped in humor, it didn't feel like a direct challenge to royal authority. A joke about incompetent generals wasn't technically questioning the Sultan's military leadership, it was just entertainment. This psychological buffer allowed rulers to hear harsh truths about their government without feeling personally attacked or losing face in front of their advisors. The system also provided perfect cover for testing controversial ideas. A sultan could have his Nedim tell jokes about hypothetical policy changes, then gauge the audience reaction to see how those policies might be received by the broader population. If the jokes landed well, it suggested the policies might be popular. If they bombed, it was just bad comedy, no political embarrassment required. Some of the most successful court jesters became masters of what palace insiders called mirror comedy, performances that reflected the Sultan's own thoughts and concerns back to him through seemingly innocent entertainment. They would craft elaborate comedic scenarios that paralleled real political situations, allowing the ruler to work through complex decisions by seeing them played out in humorous fictional contexts. The political protection this system provided was extraordinary. When Sultan Bayezid II wanted to criticize his own Grand Vizier's handling of tax collection, but couldn't do so directly without undermining governmental authority, he simply attended a dinner where his favorite comedian happened to perform an extended routine about bumbling administrators who couldn't count past 10. The message was received, the vizier was quietly replaced, and officially, nothing political had happened at all. This comedic safety valve served another crucial function. It allowed the population to voice dissent without triggering repression. When traveling meta-performers carried jokes about government policies from city to city, they were essentially facilitating an empire-wide conversation about political issues. People could laugh at jokes about corrupt officials or unpopular laws without technically engaging in sedition. The most skilled court jesters developed an almost supernatural ability to read the political climate and adjust their material accordingly. They understood instinctively which topics were ripe for comedic treatment and which were still too sensitive to touch. Palace chronicles describe performers who could sense shifts in political alliances from subtle changes in dinner conversation, then craft jokes that helped their audiences process these developments. But the system had its dark side too. Clever jesters could manipulate their audiences by choosing which subjects to mock and which to treat respectfully. A comedian who consistently made fun of the Sultan's enemies while avoiding jokes about his allies was essentially providing political commentary disguised as neutral entertainment. Some historians argue that successful court jesters wielded more political influence than many government officials because they could shape public opinion through their choice of comedic targets. The international implications were fascinating. Foreign diplomats quickly learned to pay attention to what the court jesters were saying during state dinners because their jokes often revealed the Ottoman government's real attitudes toward different countries and policies. A Venetian ambassador might learn more about Ottoman trade policy from listening to dinner comedy than from formal diplomatic negotiations. Historians still argue whether this system was consciously designed as a political tool or simply evolved naturally from the intersection of entertainment and power, but the evidence suggests it was remarkably sophisticated. Palace libraries contain detailed guides on appropriate targets for comedic criticism and the proper limits of satirical commentary, essentially instruction manuals for using humor as a political instrument. The effectiveness of this approach is documented in numerous historical examples where comedic criticism led to actual policy changes. When jokes about the empire's road maintenance problems became a recurring theme in palace entertainment, Sultan Selim I quietly increased funding for infrastructure projects. When court jesters began mocking the inefficiency of the tax collection system, administrative reforms followed within months. What made this system particularly brilliant was how it turned potential political opposition into collaborative problem solving. Instead of driving criticism underground where it might fester into rebellion, the comedic safety valve allowed dissent to be expressed. You're about to witness the most terrifying job interview process in human history, where a single poorly timed punchline could mean the difference between wealth beyond imagination and a very short, very unpleasant life. The Great Joke Audition, as palace insiders called it, wasn't a formal event with scheduled appointments and waiting rooms. Instead, it was an ongoing, ruthless elimination process that could last for years and involved levels of psychological manipulation that would make modern reality TV producers weep with admiration. Aspiring court comedians typically began their journey in the palace's outer courtyards, performing for kitchen staff, guards, and minor officials during meal breaks. This wasn't just practice, it was intelligence gathering. The established court jesters had spies throughout the palace hierarchy who reported back on promising new talent. If you could make a tired cook laugh after a 16-hour shift preparing royal feasts, you might have what it took to entertain a sultan. But here's where it gets brutal. The existing court entertainers viewed newcomers not as potential colleagues, but as direct threats to their livelihood. Remember that entertainment hierarchy we discussed earlier. Each level was fiercely protected by those who'd fought their way up the ladder, and they weren't about to let some upstart comedian threaten their position without a fight. The sabotage was legendary. Established performers would spread false information about what types of jokes the Sultan currently enjoyed, leading aspiring comedians to prepare material that was guaranteed to fail. They'd arrange for accidents during crucial performances, a mysteriously loose floorboard that would send a nervous performer tumbling, or strategically spilled wine that would ruin a comedian's costume at the worst possible moment. Some veteran court jesters developed elaborate hazing rituals disguised as training opportunities. They'd invite promising newcomers to perform at private dinner parties hosted by minor palace officials, then arrange for the audience to be filled with people primed to react negatively to any humor attempts. The psychological damage from bombing in front of what they thought was a friendly crowd could shatter a comedian's confidence permanently. The actual audition process, when it finally came, was designed to be as stressful as possible. Aspiring performers would be given no advanced notice. They might be pulled from kitchen duty or guard rotation and told they had 5 minutes to prepare for an impromptu performance in front of the Sultan and his dinner guests. No warm-up, no test audience, no second chances. The performance space itself was psychologically intimidating. Picture this. You're standing in the center of a vast dining hall with soaring ceilings and walls covered in intricate tilework that probably cost more than your village's annual income. Seated around you are some of the most powerful people in the known world, all watching your every gesture while continuing to eat their dinner as if you're just background entertainment. The silence before you begin is crushing. Unlike modern comedy clubs where audiences come expecting to laugh, palace dinner guests were there primarily to eat and conduct business. If your opening line didn't immediately capture their attention, you'd quickly become invisible, and invisible performers didn't get invited back. What made the audition process particularly treacherous was the unspoken rule system that nobody explained to newcomers. Certain topics were absolutely forbidden, but the list of taboo subjects changed depending on current political situations, the Sultan's mood, recent military campaigns, diplomatic relations with neighboring powers, and even the phase of the moon according to palace astrologers. A joke about tax collection might be hilarious one week and grounds for execution the next, depending on whether the treasury was currently full or empty. References to the Sultan's family could be endearing or treasonous depending on recent developments in succession politics. Even seemingly innocent observations about the weather could backfire if they coincidentally echoed complaints made by enemy diplomats. The psychological pressure was so intense that many aspiring comedians developed what palace physicians called audition sickness, symptoms including trembling hands, voice cracking, memory loss, and in severe cases, complete mental breakdown. Some performers who'd been confident and funny during informal practice sessions would freeze completely when faced with the Sultan's dinner table. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the audition process was its unpredictability. There was no standard format, no typical length, no consistent judging criteria. One aspiring comedian might be asked to perform for 20 minutes and be evaluated on their storytelling ability. Another might be given 30 seconds to deliver a single joke and judged entirely on timing and delivery. The feedback system was equally brutal and inconsistent. Sometimes a performer would receive no reaction at all, not laughter, not boos, just deadly silence followed by dismissal. Other times, the Sultan might laugh uproariously at a joke that the rest of the audience found mediocre, leading to confusion about whether the performance was successful or not. Historians still argue whether this chaotic audition system was deliberately designed to weed out all but the most psychologically resilient performers, or whether it simply evolved naturally from the intersection of palace politics and entertainment culture. The evidence suggests it was probably both, a system that started as practical necessity but became increasingly elaborate as it proved effective at identifying comedians who could handle the extreme pressure of court life. The successful candidates who survived this gauntlet shared certain characteristics: unshakable confidence, supernatural ability to read social situations, quick recovery from failure, and most importantly, the psychological flexibility to adapt their... You're about to meet the comedy legends whose names still echo through Turkish coffee houses, and whose wit was so sharp it could slice through palace intrigue like a Damascus blade through silk. The most famous of all Ottoman court jesters wasn't technically a person at all, but a shadow puppet character named Karagöz, though the master puppeteer who brought him to life became nearly as legendary as his creation. Picture this. You're sitting in a darkened palace dining hall, watching flickering shadows dance across a translucent screen while a single performer behind the curtain voices dozens of characters, each with distinct personalities, accents, and comedic timing that would make modern voice actors weep with envy. The Karagöz tradition supposedly began when Sultan Orhan became so entertained by the banter between two construction workers building a mosque that he had their conversations immortalized as shadow puppet performances. Whether this origin story is historically accurate or just a clever piece of palace mythology, historians still argue whether the real Karagöz and Hasavat were actual people or composite characters created from various court entertainers. What made the Karagöz puppeteer so powerful was his ability to voice criticism that no human performer could safely express. When the puppet characters mocked government officials or made jokes about palace corruption, the Sultan could always claim it was just harmless entertainment performed by fictional characters. This gave the puppeteer unprecedented freedom to push boundaries that would have gotten flesh and blood comedians executed on the spot. But the human court jesters were equally remarkable in their own ways. Take Nasruddin Hoja, whose jokes became so famous they spread throughout the Islamic world and are still told today. Nasruddin perfected the art of the philosophical joke, humor that seemed simple on the surface, but contained layers of meaning that could be interpreted differently depending on your perspective and intelligence level. His most famous routine involved searching for his lost keys under a street lamp, not because he dropped them there, but because the light was better. When palace guests laughed at this apparent foolishness, they were unknowingly laughing at their own tendency to look for solutions in convenient places rather than where problems actually existed. The Sultan could enjoy the surface humor while simultaneously appreciating the subtle commentary on human nature and administrative incompetence. Then there was Bekri Mustafa, the court jester who specialized in what we might now call roast comedy. His specialty was making devastating observations about dinner guests' personal habits, appearance, and behavior, while maintaining such a cheerful, innocent demeanor that his targets couldn't quite decide whether they'd been insulted or complimented. He once told a notoriously corrupt governor that his hands were so skilled at collecting taxes that they could probably pick fruit from trees without even looking. A joke that worked on multiple levels depending on how familiar you were with the governor's reputation for taking bribes. The female entertainers, though less documented in official records, were equally formidable. Palace women developed their own comedy traditions, often performing for the Sultan's wives and concubines during private dinner gatherings. These performances were particularly dangerous because they took place in the highly charged political environment of the imperial harem, where a poorly received joke could trigger deadly feuds between competing court factions. One legendary female performer, known only as the Nightingale in surviving palace documents, reportedly specialized in mimicking the voices and mannerisms of various sultans' mothers. Her impressions were so accurate and cutting that she could reduce powerful palace officials to helpless laughter, while simultaneously terrifying them with the precision of her observations. The competition between court jesters was intense and occasionally deadly. Professional jealousy in the palace entertainment world made modern Hollywood rivalries look like friendly disagreements between kindergarten children. Established performers would go to extraordinary lengths to sabotage their competitors, including bribing kitchen staff to serve rivals spoiled food before important performances, spreading rumors about their political loyalties, and in extreme cases, arranging for accidents that would permanently damage a competitor's career. The most successful court jesters developed signature styles that became their trademark protection. Nobody else could copy Carragher's shadow puppet technique without being obvious imitators. Nasruddin's philosophical humor required genuine wisdom and life experience that couldn't be easily replicated. Bekri Mustafa's roasting style demanded such precise social intelligence that wannabe imitators usually ended up offending their audiences rather than entertaining them. What's fascinating is how these legendary performers influenced each other despite their professional rivalries. Palace records describe informal late-night comedy workshops where established jesters would share techniques and test new material on each other. These sessions were conducted under strict secrecy because admitting collaboration could undermine their individual reputations for spontaneous wit. The most successful court jesters also developed elaborate backup plans for their inevitable fall from favor. They cultivated relationships with wealthy merchants, provincial governors, and even foreign diplomats who might need entertainment services when palace life became too dangerous. Smart performers diversified their skill sets, learning music, storytelling, and even basic administrative tasks that could provide alternative career paths. Remember that audition process we discussed earlier. These legendary performers had all survived that gauntlet and then spent years refining their craft. You're now witnessing the most sophisticated psychological warfare ever conducted over dinner plates, where the placement of a single cushion could determine whether a rival lived to see morning, and the timing of a well-placed joke could topple entire political careers. The Ottoman Imperial Dining Hall wasn't just a place to eat. It was a carefully orchestrated theater of power where every element, from seating arrangements to the sequence of comedic performances, served as weapons in an ongoing battle for influence and survival. The Sultan didn't just invite people to dinner, he summoned them to participate in elaborate games of social chess where laughter was currency and silence could be deadly. Picture the scene. A vast hall with a low table stretching nearly 40 feet, surrounded by silk cushions arranged in a precise hierarchy that palace protocol officers spent hours perfecting. Your position relative to the Sultan's seat communicated your current political status to everyone present, and a sudden change in seating could signal either rising favor or impending doom. Guests would arrive early just to observe where others were positioned, reading the cushion placements like a complex political map. The Sultan's master of ceremonies, working in coordination with the head court jester, would orchestrate the evening's entertainment to maximize psychological impact on specific targets. If a provincial governor had been skimming tax revenues, he might find himself seated directly across from the Sultan, while the evening's comedy focused heavily on jokes about dishonest administrators. The poor governor would be trapped between laughing at jokes that essentially described his own crimes or sitting stone-faced while everyone around him enjoyed the performance. Either reaction could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. The timing of comedic interruptions was equally strategic. Important political discussions would be deliberately punctuated by seemingly spontaneous jokes that actually reinforced or undermined whatever point was being made. A diplomat arguing for increased trade agreements might find his presentation interrupted by a hilarious story about merchants who promised one thing and delivered another. The humor made the criticism seem light-hearted and coincidental, but the political message was unmistakable. Court jesters developed an intricate system of signals with palace servants to coordinate their performances with the dinner service itself. A joke about gluttony might be timed to coincide with a guest reaching for a particularly large portion of food. Observations about vanity would be delivered just as someone adjusted their turban or smoothed their beard. These moments of perfect timing created the illusion of spontaneous wit while actually requiring hours of careful choreography. The most devastating weapon in this psychological arsenal was the targeted roast disguised as general entertainment. A skilled court jester could deliver what appeared to be a routine comedy performance that was actually a precision-guided character assassination of a specific dinner guest. The victim would realize they were being systematically destroyed through humor, but couldn't object without seeming humorless or confirming the accuracy of the jokes being made at their expense. Historians still argue whether the famous Feast of the Bleeding Hearts in 1574 was a real event or palace mythology, but the story illustrates how dinner entertainment could be weaponized. According to the tale, Sultan Murad III invited 7 competing court officials to dinner and had the evening's comedy focus entirely on the theme of loyalty and betrayal. By the end of the meal, 4 of the guests had been so psychologically unnerved by jokes that seemed to reference their secret activities that they confessed to various crimes and begged for mercy. The seating arrangements themselves became increasingly complex as the empire expanded and the number of important dinner guests grew. Palace protocol required that guests be seated according to multiple hierarchies simultaneously: military rank, administrative position, family connections, current favor with the sultan, and even astrological compatibility according to court fortune tellers. A single dinner party might require a team of mathematicians to calculate the optimal cushion placement. Smart dinner guests learned to read the comedy performances as carefully as they listened to official announcements. A joke about the dangers of overconfidence might be a warning to ambitious generals. Humor focused on the importance of family loyalty could signal changing succession politics. References to foreign customs might indicate shifting diplomatic policies. The court jesters essentially functioned as the Sultan's unofficial propaganda ministry, using entertainment to communicate messages that couldn't be stated directly. The psychological pressure on dinner guests was enormous. You had to laugh at the right moments, but not too enthusiastically at jokes that might be testing your loyalty. You needed to appear entertained without seeming frivolous. Most importantly, you had to avoid any reaction that could be interpreted as guilty knowledge when jokes touched on sensitive political topics. The Sultan's own behavior during these dinner performances was carefully observed and analyzed by every guest present. His laughter or lack thereof could indicate approval or disapproval of the evening's targets. A subtle smile at a joke about corruption could signal that investigations were forthcoming. Complete silence during humor aimed at a particular guest might mean that person was already marked for elimination. Court jesters developed the ability to read these subtle imperial reactions and adjust their performances in real time. If the Sultan seemed displeased with a particular line of humor, the jester could seamlessly pivot to different material. If he appeared to be enjoying jokes at a specific guest's expense, you're about to discover how the Ottoman Empire's dinner comedy became the world's first truly multicultural entertainment fusion, blending jokes, stories, and comedic traditions from across 3 continents into something entirely new and surprisingly modern in its approach to cross-cultural humor. The Ottoman Empire at its height stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, encompassing dozens of distinct ethnic groups, languages, and comedic traditions. Rather than suppressing these diverse humor styles, the imperial court actively collected and synthesized them, creating what palace chroniclers called the Great Jest Library, a constantly evolving repository of jokes, stories, and comedic techniques drawn from every corner of the known world. Greek comedic traditions contributed the art of the double entendre and sophisticated wordplay that could work on multiple linguistic levels simultaneously. Ottoman court jesters learned to craft jokes that were funny in Turkish, but became even funnier if you also understood Greek references embedded within them. A seemingly simple joke about a fisherman might contain layers of meaning that referenced ancient Greek philosophy, contemporary political situations, and private jokes shared among the palace's Greek-speaking administrators. The influence of Jewish humor traditions was particularly profound, introducing concepts that we now recognize as fundamental to modern comedy. Jewish court entertainers brought techniques of self-deprecating humor, the strategic use of apparent weakness as comedic strength, and most importantly, the ability to find absurdity in suffering and oppression. These approaches proved perfectly suited to palace life, where everyone except the Sultan lived under constant threat and needed coping mechanisms for psychological survival. Armenian comedic traditions contributed elaborate storytelling techniques and the art of the extended anecdote that could weave together multiple plot threads while building to unexpected punchlines. Armenian court jesters were masters of what we might now call callback humor, establishing seemingly unrelated details early in a performance, then bringing them together in surprising ways that created laughter through pattern recognition and narrative satisfaction rather than simple surprise. Arab comedic traditions, particularly those from Baghdad and Damascus, brought sophisticated social satire and the art of political commentary disguised as entertainment. Arab court entertainers had centuries of experience performing for powerful rulers who could have them executed for crossing invisible lines, so they developed extremely subtle techniques for delivering criticism through seemingly innocent observations about daily life, weather patterns, or animal behavior. Persian influences were perhaps the most significant, providing the foundational structure for Ottoman court comedy. Persian entertainment traditions emphasized elegance, sophistication, and the ability to maintain dignity while being ridiculous, qualities that perfectly matched Ottoman imperial aesthetics. Persian jesters had mastered the art of making powerful people laugh without making them feel foolish, a crucial skill for anyone hoping to survive in the Sultan's dining hall. The fusion process wasn't always smooth or peaceful. Different comedic traditions sometimes clashed in spectacular fashion when performers from various backgrounds competed for imperial favor. Palace records describe legendary comedy battles where Greek jesters would challenge Armenian storytellers to improvisation contests, or where Arab satirists would attempt to outwit Persian philosophers through increasingly elaborate verbal sparring matches. These cross-cultural comedy competitions led to the development of entirely new performance formats. The Babel Feast became a popular imperial entertainment where jesters from different ethnic backgrounds would collaborate on single performances, each contributing elements from their traditional styles while attempting to create coherent entertainment that worked for the diverse palace audience. The linguistic complexity alone was staggering. A single joke might include Turkish, Persian, Arabic, and Greek elements, requiring audience members to be multilingual just to fully appreciate the humor. What's fascinating is how these multicultural influences created comedy that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more accessible than its individual components. A joke that drew on Jewish self-deprecation, Armenian storytelling, Greek wordplay, and Persian elegance could work on multiple levels for different audience members while still being fundamentally funny to someone who only understood Turkish. The court jesters themselves became increasingly multicultural as the empire matured. Successful performers were expected to master comedic techniques from at least 3 different cultural traditions, and the most celebrated entertainers could seamlessly blend elements from 5 or 6 different approaches within a single performance. This wasn't just cultural appreciation. It was professional survival in an environment where your audience might include Greek administrators, Arab merchants, Armenian craftsmen, Persian poets, and Turkish military officers, all seated around the same dinner table. Historians still argue whether this multicultural approach to humor was a deliberate imperial policy designed to promote cultural unity, or simply the natural result of bringing together so many different comedic traditions in a single palace environment. The evidence suggests it was probably both. Palace administrators recognized that entertainment could serve diplomatic purposes, while performers naturally adapted to their diverse audiences. The influence of Romani performance traditions added another crucial element: the art of physical comedy and musical humor. Roma entertainers brought techniques for incorporating music, dance, and visual gags into comedic performances, transforming Ottoman court entertainment from purely verbal wit into multimedia experiences that could engage audiences on multiple sensory levels simultaneously. The synthesis wasn't just additive. These different traditions genuinely influenced and changed each other. Greek wordplay became more sophisticated when combined with Persian philosophical depth. Jewish self-deprecation became more elegant when filtered through Ottoman imperial aesthetics. Armenian storytelling became more politically sharp when you're about to learn how telling jokes to sultans could make you richer than most provincial governors, but also discover why the phrase dying rich took on an entirely literal meaning in the world of Ottoman court entertainment. The economics of palace comedy were absolutely staggering and completely different from any other form of employment in the empire. A successful court jester could accumulate wealth that rivaled that of successful merchants, military commanders, and even some members of the royal family, but they could also lose everything, including their lives, with a single poorly received performance. The basic compensation structure for court entertainers was surprisingly complex and varied dramatically based on your position in the palace hierarchy. Entry-level performers might receive only meals and basic clothing, essentially working for survival while hoping to advance to more lucrative positions. But once you reached the inner circle of established court jesters, the financial rewards became extraordinary. Top-tier court comedians received what palace accountants called laughter stipends, regular payments that were calculated based on how frequently the Sultan requested their services, how long their performances lasted, and most importantly, how enthusiastically the imperial audience responded to their material. A jester who could consistently make the Sultan laugh until tears ran down his face might earn more in a single evening than a skilled craftsman could make in an entire year. But the real money came from what modern entertainers would recognize as corporate sponsorship deals. Wealthy merchants, ambitious court officials, and even foreign diplomats would secretly pay court jesters to include subtle promotional content in their performances. A joke that portrayed a particular trading company in a positive light, or humor that subtly undermined the reputation of a business rival, could be worth enormous sums to the people involved. The sponsorship arrangements were incredibly sophisticated for their time. Court jesters developed detailed rate cards for different types of promotional content. A passing reference to a merchant's honesty might cost 50 gold pieces, while an extended comedic routine that portrayed someone as trustworthy and competent could command hundreds. The most expensive service was negative humor targeting someone's enemies, which required the jester to take significant personal risks while maintaining plausible deniability. Palace records suggest that successful court entertainers often accumulated enough wealth to purchase their own estates, maintain large households with dozens of servants, and even engage in international trade ventures. Some jesters became silent partners in major commercial enterprises, using their palace access to gather economic intelligence that proved incredibly valuable for investment decisions. The lifestyle of wealthy court comedians was paradoxically both luxurious and precarious. They lived in beautiful homes filled with expensive furnishings, wore clothing that cost more than most people's annual income, and dined on delicacies imported from across the known world. But they also lived under constant threat of sudden death or exile, which created a unique psychological relationship with money and material possessions. This precariousness led to the development of what palace observers called jester economics, financial strategies specifically designed for people whose careers could end violently and without warning. Successful court entertainers developed elaborate networks of hidden assets, secret bank accounts in foreign cities, and emergency escape plans that could be activated within hours if palace politics turned against them. The smartest court jesters diversified their income streams beyond just palace performances. They invested in legitimate businesses, purchased property in multiple cities, and developed alternative career paths that could provide income if they fell from imperial favor. Some became successful merchants in their own right, using their palace connections to facilitate trade deals. Others invested in education, learning skills like accounting, diplomacy, or even medicine that could provide employment opportunities outside the entertainment world. The social status that came with successful court comedy was equally complex and contradictory. On one hand, wealthy jesters were invited to the finest social gatherings, sought after as dinner guests by important families, and treated with respect by people who normally wouldn't acknowledge the existence of mere entertainers. Their children could marry into respectable merchant families, and their recommendations could help friends and relatives secure prestigious positions. But the flip side was constant social anxiety, and the knowledge that their elevated status was entirely dependent on the continued amusement of a single individual who was famous for his unpredictable moods and violent temper. No matter how rich they became, court jesters remained essentially servants whose entire fortune could disappear with one poorly timed joke or political miscalculation. Historians still argue whether the extreme financial rewards were intended as compensation for the extraordinary personal risks, or whether they represented the genuine market value of entertainment that could influence imperial policy decisions. The evidence suggests both factors played important roles. Palace administrators understood that attracting the best comedic talent required competitive compensation, while the political influence wielded by successful jesters made their services genuinely valuable to various court factions. The most successful court entertainers developed what we might now recognize as early versions of talent management agencies. Established jesters would identify and train promising newcomers, taking percentages of their earnings in exchange for introductions, coaching, and protection from the more dangerous aspects of palace politics. These mentor-protege relationships created comedy dynasties that could span multiple generations. The taxation of jester income was a constant source of palace intrigue. Regular court officials paid standard taxes on their salaries, but the irregular and often secretive nature of entertainment compensation made it difficult for imperial accountants to calculate appropriate tax obligations. Some jesters, you're about to enter the most dangerous conversational minefield in human history, where certain words could trigger immediate execution, and comedians developed elaborate coded languages just to avoid accidentally committing treason while trying to get a laugh. The list of forbidden topics for Ottoman court jesters wasn't written down anywhere, which was precisely what made it so terrifying. Palace entertainment operated under an invisible web of taboos that changed constantly based on current politics, recent military campaigns, the Sultan's personal relationships, religious sensitivities, diplomatic situations, and even seasonal considerations that made no logical sense to outsiders, but were matters of life and death for performers. The most obvious forbidden territory involved any direct criticism of the Sultan himself, but the boundaries of what constituted criticism were maddeningly unclear and constantly shifting. A joke about someone being forgetful might be perfectly acceptable one week, then become grounds for execution the next if the Sultan had recently made a public error that his enemies were privately mocking. Comedians learned to develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to the imperial mood, reading tiny facial expressions and body language cues that might indicate whether familiar material had suddenly become dangerous. Religious humor occupied an especially treacherous middle ground. Islamic law technically prohibited certain types of religious mockery, but the Sultan's court operated under different rules than regular society, and religious authorities often disagreed about where the boundaries lay. A joke that seemed perfectly acceptable to the palace imam might be considered blasphemous by outside religious scholars, creating situations where jesters could be simultaneously blessed by court religious authorities and condemned by clerics in the broader Islamic community. The succession question was absolutely forbidden territory, but the definition of succession-related content expanded to include virtually any humor about family relationships, aging, health, inheritance, or even seemingly innocent jokes about fathers and sons. Court jesters developed elaborate metaphorical languages for discussing these topics indirectly. Jokes about gardening might actually be commentary on political cultivation, while stories about animal behavior could reference court family dynamics without explicitly mentioning human relationships. Military defeats were completely off-limits, but the challenge was that the definition of defeat was subject to creative interpretation by palace propaganda officials. A strategic retreat might be officially classified as a victory, making jokes about retreat potentially treasonous even if they accurately described recent events. Comedians had to stay current with official military narratives and adjust their material accordingly, often having to abandon entire comedic routines overnight when political interpretations of recent battles changed. Foreign policy humor was particularly dangerous because it could accidentally trigger diplomatic incidents. A seemingly innocent joke about Persian customs might be perfectly acceptable during peacetime, but could be interpreted as hostile propaganda if tensions were rising with the Safavid Empire. Court jesters were expected to understand complex international relationships and predict how their humor might be interpreted by foreign ambassadors who were present at palace dinners. The most famous cautionary tale involved a court comedian known as Laughing Ibrahim, who made a joke about camels being more reliable than horses during a dinner party in 1623. Unknown to Ibrahim, the Ottoman military had recently suffered significant cavalry losses in a campaign against Polish forces, and several dinner guests interpreted his animal humor as commentary on military incompetence. Ibrahim was executed 3 days later, and his death became legendary among court entertainers as an example of how seemingly innocent material could become deadly without warning. Personal topics related to the imperial family were absolutely forbidden, but the definition of personal was impossibly broad and included references to clothing, food preferences, daily routines, health habits, and even weather observations that might somehow reflect on imperial comfort or competence. A joke about someone enjoying too much sleep could be treasonous if the Sultan had recently been criticized for spending long hours in his private chambers. The most sophisticated court jesters developed what historians call escape hatch, of delivering potentially dangerous material while maintaining plausible alternative interpretations if the humor was poorly received. A joke that seemed to mock government corruption could be quickly reframed as praise for honest administrators. Stories that appeared to criticize military strategy could be redirected as celebrations of imperial wisdom. The best performers could pivot mid-sentence if they sensed their material was heading into dangerous territory. Historians still argue whether some court jesters deliberately pushed boundaries as a form of political resistance, or whether they were simply gambling addicts who became psychologically dependent on the adrenaline rush of performing dangerous material. The evidence suggests both motivations existed, sometimes within the same performer who might spend months delivering safe, conventional humor before suddenly attempting increasingly risky material that seemed designed to test imperial patience. The punishment for crossing forbidden lines varied dramatically and unpredictably. Some offenders were immediately executed, while others faced exile, imprisonment, or physical punishments that left them alive but unable to continue performing. The inconsistency was probably deliberate. Unpredictable consequences created more psychological pressure than consistent punishments would have generated. The paranoia created by these forbidden topics fundamentally changed the nature of Ottoman court comedy. Performers became experts at reading subtext, developing almost telepathic abilities to sense audience reactions and adjust their material accordingly. They learned to embed multiple layers of meaning in every joke, creating humor that could be interpreted differently depending on the listener's political perspective and current events. The most successful court entertainers mastered the art of seeming spontaneous while actually delivering carefully rehearsed material that had been tested extensively in private settings. They developed networks of trusted friends who could provide feedback on potentially dangerous content before it was performed in front of the Sultan. These informal focus groups became crucial survival tools for navigating the constantly shifting landscape. You're about to embark on a journey across the vast Ottoman Empire, discovering how a joke that killed in Istanbul might get you literally killed in Baghdad, and how local humor traditions created a comedic United Nations that somehow functioned despite speaking completely different languages of laughter. The Ottoman Empire's incredible geographic diversity meant that court jesters had to master not just different languages, but entirely different concepts of what constituted humor. What made a Turkish audience roar with laughter might leave Arab dinner guests sitting in confused silence, while Persian courtiers might find hilarious subtleties in jokes that seemed completely flat to everyone else in the room. In Istanbul, the imperial capital, court comedy reached its most sophisticated and dangerous levels. Palace entertainers here dealt with the highest stakes, the most complex political situations, and audiences that included representatives from across the empire who brought their own cultural expectations and sensitivities. Istanbul jesters became masters of what we might call diplomatic humor, comedy that could work across multiple cultural contexts simultaneously without offending anyone's ethnic pride or religious sensibilities. Travel southeast to the Arab provinces, particularly Damascus and Baghdad, and you'd encounter court entertainment traditions that emphasized different comedic values entirely. Arab regional governors maintained their own palace entertainers who specialized in elaborate storytelling traditions that could stretch single anecdotes across multiple dinner courses. These performers were masters of suspense and misdirection, building complex narrative structures that kept audiences engaged through subtle character development and unexpected plot twists that made the eventual punchlines feel both surprising and inevitable. The humor in Arab provinces also tended to be more intellectually challenging, drawing heavily on classical Arabic poetry, religious scholarship, and philosophical traditions that required extensive education to fully appreciate. A dinner guest who lacked proper literary background might miss entire layers of meaning in performances that seemed simple on the surface, but actually contained sophisticated commentary on theology, politics, and social issues. Persian-influenced regions, particularly areas that had been part of the Safavid Empire before Ottoman conquest, maintained their own distinct comedic traditions that emphasized elegance, wordplay, and what Persian entertainers called the art of beautiful mockery. Humor that could devastate its targets while maintaining such poetic sophistication that being insulted almost felt like receiving a compliment. Persian court jesters were particularly skilled at incorporating musical elements into their performances, creating what were essentially comedy concerts where jokes, songs, and instrumental interludes blended together into seamless entertainment experiences that could last for hours. These musical comedy traditions influenced Ottoman court entertainment throughout the empire, but they remained most sophisticated in regions with strong Persian cultural heritage. The Balkan provinces presented entirely different challenges for court entertainers. Local populations retained strong connections to Orthodox Christian traditions, Slavic folklore, and Central European cultural influences that created unique comedic sensibilities. Ottoman administrators in these regions had to navigate complex religious and ethnic tensions, which meant court entertainment needed to be carefully calibrated to avoid inflaming existing cultural conflicts. Balkan court jesters developed specialties in what might be called bridge comedy, humor that could bring together Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Catholics, and various ethnic groups around shared human experiences while avoiding topics that might trigger religious or nationalist sensitivities. These performers became expert anthropologists, studying local folklore traditions and incorporating familiar story patterns and character types into their routines. The North African provinces, particularly Egypt, brought their own ancient entertainment traditions that predated both Ottoman and Arab conquest. Egyptian court entertainers drew on thousands of years of performance history, incorporating elements from pharaonic storytelling traditions, Coptic Christian influences, and various Mediterranean cultural exchanges that had shaped the region's approach to humor and entertainment. Egyptian court comedy was particularly sophisticated in its use of visual elements, elaborate costumes, props, and even trained animals that could participate in comedic routines. Palace entertainers in Cairo developed multimedia performances that combined storytelling, music, visual comedy, and audience participation in ways that influenced Ottoman court entertainment traditions throughout the empire. What's remarkable is how these regional variations created a kind of comedic exchange program throughout the empire. Successful court jesters would travel between different provincial capitals, learning new techniques and adapting their material to different cultural contexts. A comedian who mastered Istanbul palace entertainment might spend several years in Damascus learning Arab storytelling traditions, then travel to Cairo to study Egyptian visual comedy techniques before returning to the imperial capital with an expanded repertoire of skills. This cultural exchange created hybrid entertainment forms that were genuinely international in scope. A single court performance might include Persian musical elements, Arab narrative structures, Turkish wordplay, Balkan folk influences, and Egyptian visual comedy techniques, all blended together by a performer who had literally traveled thousands of miles to master these different traditions. The linguistic challenges alone were staggering. Court jesters needed to understand not just different languages, but different cultural contexts for humor, varying religious sensitivities, distinct historical references, and local political situations that might affect how their material was received. A joke about merchants that worked perfectly in one province might accidentally reference local scandals or ethnic stereotypes that could trigger serious conflicts in another region. Historians still argue whether this regional diversity strengthened or weakened the Ottoman Empire's cultural unity, but there's no question that it created some of the most sophisticated and culturally complex entertainment in world history. Court jesters essentially became cultural ambassadors, you're about to witness the slow, painful death of a centuries-old tradition as European influences, modernization pressures, and changing imperial priorities gradually strangled the life out of Ottoman court comedy, leaving behind only echoes of laughter in empty palace halls. The decline of the Ottoman court jester tradition didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual strangulation that took place over nearly 2 centuries, beginning in the late 1600s and accelerating dramatically during the empire's final decades. What makes this decline particularly tragic is that it coincided with some of the most politically turbulent periods in Ottoman history, precisely when the empire could have benefited most from the psychological relief and social commentary that skilled court entertainers provided. The first major blow came from the increasing European military pressure that forced Ottoman sultans to focus obsessively on military modernization and diplomatic survival. Palace resources that had once supported elaborate entertainment programs were redirected toward purchasing modern weapons, hiring European military advisors, and maintaining increasingly expensive armies equipped with the latest technology. Court comedy began to seem like a frivolous luxury that the empire could no longer afford, but the deeper problem was cultural. European diplomatic and military advisors brought with them distinctly different attitudes toward entertainment and the relationship between rulers and their subjects. European court traditions emphasized formal ceremonies, rigid protocols, and entertainment forms that reinforced hierarchical relationships rather than providing opportunities for subtle social criticism or psychological release. The idea of allowing entertainers to mock government officials, even indirectly, seemed dangerously subversive to European advisors who were accustomed to more authoritarian approaches to imperial governance. The introduction of European-style military discipline into palace life created another major obstacle for traditional court entertainers. European military advisors insisted on regular schedules, predictable routines, and formal meeting structures that left little room for the spontaneous entertainment sessions that had been central to Ottoman palace culture. Dinner became a functional necessity rather than an opportunity for elaborate social and comedic performances. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-1800s, while necessary for the empire's survival, inadvertently accelerated the decline of court entertainment traditions. These modernization efforts emphasized bureaucratic efficiency, written documentation, and standardized procedures that were fundamentally incompatible with the informal, improvisational nature of traditional court comedy. Palace administrators trained in European administrative methods saw court jesters as anachronistic obstacles to efficient governance rather than valuable sources of social intelligence and psychological support. Religious reform movements also contributed to the decline of court entertainment. Islamic reformers, influenced by more austere interpretations of religious law, began questioning whether elaborate comedy performances were appropriate for Muslim rulers. These religious critics argued that palace resources should be directed toward more serious pursuits like education, military preparation, and social welfare, rather than what they characterized as frivolous entertainment. The changing nature of Ottoman palace life itself made traditional court comedy increasingly difficult to sustain. Earlier sultans had maintained relatively intimate court environments where they interacted regularly with small groups of advisors, family members, and entertainers. But political pressures and security concerns gradually transformed palace life into a more formal, heavily guarded environment where spontaneous entertainment became logistically difficult and potentially dangerous. European influence introduced alternative entertainment forms that gradually displaced traditional Ottoman comedy. European theater, opera, and musical performances began appearing at imperial functions, bringing with them different aesthetic values and performance styles that emphasized technical skill over social commentary or psychological insight. These imported entertainment forms seemed more modern and civilized to palace officials who were desperately concerned with projecting an image of Ottoman sophistication to European observers. The decline wasn't uniform across the empire. Some provincial governors continued maintaining traditional court entertainers long after the practice had essentially disappeared from the imperial capital. But even these regional holdouts found it increasingly difficult to justify entertainment expenditures as military and administrative pressures mounted throughout the empire's territories. The most successful court jesters attempted to adapt to changing circumstances by developing new performance styles that incorporated European influences while maintaining traditional elements. Some learned to perform European-style theater while smuggling traditional Ottoman humor into their roles. Others attempted to create hybrid entertainment forms that combined traditional storytelling with European musical techniques. But these adaptation efforts largely failed because they fundamentally misunderstood the role that court comedy had played in Ottoman political culture. Traditional court jesters weren't just entertainers, they were psychological therapists, social critics, intelligence gatherers, and diplomatic communicators whose functions couldn't be replicated by imported European entertainment forms, no matter how technically sophisticated those alternatives might be. Historians still argue whether the decline of court comedy contributed to the broader political problems that eventually destroyed the Ottoman Empire, or whether it was simply a symptom of larger cultural changes that were inevitable given European pressure and technological advancement. The evidence suggests that the loss of traditional entertainment traditions eliminated important safety valves for political tension and removed valuable sources of social intelligence that had helped earlier sultans understand and respond to popular concerns. The final generation of Ottoman court jesters found themselves in an impossible situation. They possessed sophisticated skills that were no longer valued by palace administrators, performed functions that were no longer understood by European-influenced officials, and maintained cultural traditions that were increasingly seen as embarrassing reminders of the empire's back. You're about to discover how the ghosts of Ottoman court jesters continue to haunt Turkish comedy clubs, television studios, and coffee houses, where ancient traditions of dangerous humor and social commentary survive in forms that would be instantly recognizable to a 16th century palace entertainer. The transformation of Ottoman court comedy into modern Turkish entertainment wasn't a clean break or complete reinvention. It was more like a river that went underground for several decades before bubbling back up to the surface in new locations with familiar characteristics. The fundamental DNA of Ottoman court entertainment survived the empire's collapse and found expression in Republican Turkey through forms that maintained the essential spirit while adapting to completely different political and social circumstances. Turkish shadow puppet theater, centered around the legendary Karagöz's character we discussed earlier, became the most direct bridge between imperial court entertainment and modern Turkish comedy. During the early Republican period, when Turkey was desperately trying to modernize and westernize, Karagöz's performances provided a culturally acceptable way to maintain traditional humor while appearing to embrace folk art rather than imperial nostalgia. But what's fascinating is how these supposedly traditional folk performances actually continued the sophisticated political commentary traditions of Ottoman court jesters. Karagöz's puppeteers in the 1920s and 1930s used their performances to comment on the dramatic social changes taking place in the new Turkish Republic, employing the same techniques of coded criticism and layered meaning that their palace predecessors had perfected centuries earlier. The rise of Turkish cinema in the mid-20th century created new opportunities for former court entertainment traditions to resurface. Early Turkish comedians like Munir Özkul and Kemal Sunal developed performance styles that combined traditional Ottoman humor with modern cinematic techniques. Their films often featured elaborate dinner scenes where characters engaged in verbal sparring that directly echoed the comedic competitions that had once taken place in imperial palace dining halls. What's remarkable is how these film comedians instinctively recreated many of the social dynamics that had characterized Ottoman court entertainment. They developed hierarchical relationships within comedy troupes that mirrored the palace entertainment hierarchies. They competed fiercely for audience attention while also collaborating on complex performances that required precise timing and coordination. Most importantly, they maintained the tradition of using humor to comment on political and social issues that couldn't be addressed directly through other media. Turkish television comedy shows of the 1970s and 1980s brought court jester traditions even closer to their original form. Programs like Hababam Sinifi and various variety shows featured ensemble casts who engaged in improvised verbal competitions, used elaborate wordplay, and maintained the art of delivering social criticism through seemingly innocent entertainment. The television format even recreated some of the psychological pressure that palace entertainers had faced, performing live or near live for audiences that could make or break careers with their reactions. The political satire traditions that had been so central to Ottoman court comedy found new expression in Turkish political humor shows and stand-up comedy. Comedians like Metin Akpinar and Zeki Alasya developed performance styles that maintained the Ottoman tradition of using humor to comment on government policies and social issues, while walking the fine line between acceptable criticism and dangerous political opposition. Modern Turkish comedy continues to reflect the multicultural influences that had shaped Ottoman court entertainment. Contemporary Turkish comedians routinely incorporate elements from Greek, Armenian, Kurdish, and Arab humor traditions, creating performances that speak to Turkey's diverse population while maintaining distinctly Turkish characteristics. This cultural fusion approach directly mirrors the techniques that Ottoman court jesters had used to entertain the empire's ethnically diverse palace audiences. The economic dynamics of modern Turkish entertainment also echo Ottoman court comedy traditions. Successful Turkish comedians often accumulate significant wealth and social influence, but their careers remain dependent on maintaining public favor and avoiding political controversies that could end their careers overnight. The precarious balance between wealth and vulnerability that characterized Ottoman court jesters continues to define the Turkish entertainment industry. Turkish coffeehouse culture maintained another direct link to Ottoman court entertainment traditions. Coffee houses became informal venues where storytellers, comedians, and musicians continued performing in styles that directly descended from palace entertainment traditions. These venues provided training grounds for performers who later moved into television, film, and theater, maintaining an unbroken chain of transmission from imperial court entertainment to contemporary Turkish comedy. The tradition of using humor for psychological coping also survived the transition from empire to republic. Turkish comedy continues to serve the same therapeutic functions that Ottoman court entertainment had provided, helping people process political stress, social change, and personal anxieties through shared laughter and community experience. Historians still argue whether modern Turkish comedy consciously preserved Ottoman traditions, or whether similar social conditions naturally produced similar entertainment forms. The evidence suggests both factors played important roles. Some entertainers deliberately maintained traditional techniques, while others independently developed similar approaches in response to comparable social and political pressures. What's particularly interesting is how Turkish immigrant communities around the world have exported these comedy traditions to new cultural contexts. Turkish-German comedians, Turkish-American entertainers, and Turkish communities throughout Europe have adapted traditional Turkish humor to new languages and cultural settings, creating international variations that maintain essential characteristics while incorporating local influences. The digital age has created new opportunities for Turkish comedy traditions to reach global audiences while maintaining their distinctly Turkish characteristics. YouTube channels, social media platforms, and streaming services have allowed. You're about to witness the final curtain call of imperial entertainment, as the last court jester in Ottoman history delivers a performance that seems to acknowledge not just the end of his career, but the end of an entire civilization built on the delicate balance between power and laughter. The year was 1908, and the palace halls that had once echoed with centuries of imperial laughter were growing quieter with each passing month. The Young Turk Revolution had just transformed the Ottoman Empire into a constitutional monarchy, and Sultan Abdul Hamid II found himself trapped between traditional imperial expectations and the demands of a rapidly modernizing world that seemed to have no place for the elaborate entertainment traditions that had sustained his predecessors. The final court jester, palace records identify him only as Mehmet the Wise, was an elderly man who had served under 3 different sultans and had witnessed the gradual transformation of Ottoman court life from the confident imperialism of the mid-1800s to the desperate modernization attempts of the early 1900s. He had adapted his performances repeatedly over the decades, adjusting his material to accommodate changing political circumstances, evolving religious sensitivities, and increasing European influence on palace culture. The last performance took place during what palace chroniclers described as a farewell dinner for traditional court customs that were being eliminated as part of ongoing modernization efforts. The Sultan himself seemed melancholy, understanding that he was presiding over the systematic dismantling of cultural traditions that had defined Ottoman imperial identity for centuries. Mehmet's final routine was unlike anything recorded in earlier palace entertainment. Rather than the sharp political satire or elaborate storytelling that had characterized traditional court comedy, his performance was quietly reflective, almost philosophical in its approach to the changes taking place around them. He spoke about the passage of time, the inevitability of change, and the bittersweet nature of watching familiar worlds transform into something unrecognizable. What made the performance particularly poignant was how it seemed to acknowledge the broader historical context without directly criticizing the political decisions that were eliminating court entertainment traditions. Mehmet used the same coded language and layered meaning techniques that court jesters had employed for centuries, but applied them to the meta-commentary of discussing the end of court comedy itself. The audience that night was smaller than traditional palace entertainment gatherings, just the Sultan, a few close advisors, and some family members who understood they were witnessing the conclusion of a cultural tradition that stretched back to the empire's founding. The intimate setting created an atmosphere that was simultaneously nostalgic and melancholy, as everyone present understood the historical significance of what they were experiencing. Contemporary accounts describe the Sultan's reaction as deeply emotional. Abdul Hamid II had always been more traditional in his cultural preferences than many of his advisors, and he seemed to understand that eliminating court entertainment represented something more significant than simple administrative efficiency. The laughter that had provided psychological relief to his predecessors during the empire's most stressful periods was disappearing, just as the Ottoman Empire faced its greatest challenges. The performance ended not with the elaborate flourishes that had characterized traditional court comedy, but with a simple story about an old gardener who tended a beautiful garden for decades, watching seasons change and plants grow, until one day he realized that his work was complete and it was time for younger gardeners to tend different kinds of gardens in a changing world. The metaphor was transparent enough that everyone understood Mehmet was talking about his own career and the broader transformation of Ottoman culture, but subtle enough to maintain the tradition of court jesters delivering profound observations through seemingly simple entertainment. Even in this final performance, he maintained the fundamental characteristics that had made court comedy such an important part of Ottoman political culture. After the performance ended, there was no formal announcement that court entertainment traditions were being discontinued. Instead, there was simply silence where laughter had once filled palace halls. The positions weren't eliminated, they simply weren't filled when Mehmet retired shortly after this final performance. The palace continued hosting dinner gatherings, but they became formal affairs focused on political discussions and administrative business rather than opportunities for entertainment and social commentary. The psychological functions that court comedy had served, providing stress relief, enabling indirect political criticism, and creating moments of human connection in the midst of imperial pressure, disappeared from Ottoman court life. Historians still argue whether the elimination of court entertainment traditions contributed to the political problems that led to the empire's final collapse just 10 years later, or whether it was simply one symptom among many of a civilization that was losing touch with the cultural foundations that had sustained it for centuries. The timing suggests that the loss of these traditional pressure release valves came at precisely the moment when the empire most needed the social intelligence and psychological support that court jesters had provided. What's certain is that something essential to Ottoman political culture died with that final performance. The elaborate system of checks and balances that had allowed sultans to receive honest feedback about their policies through entertainment, the safety valves that had prevented dangerous political tensions from building up without release, and the cultural continuity that had connected the empire to its foundational traditions. All of these disappeared when the last court jester delivered his final punchline. The empty palace halls that had once resonated with centuries of imperial laughter became silent chambers where the weight of political responsibility pressed down on rulers who no longer had access to the wisdom, perspective, and psychological relief that professional humor had provided their predecessors. And so the echoes of that final performance fade into the quiet corridors of history, where the ghosts of long-dead comedians still whisper their ancient jokes to empty palace walls. You can almost hear them, can't you? The soft rustle of silk cushions, the gentle clink of golden dinner plates, the barely audible intake of breath before a perfectly timed punchline that could make an emperor weep with laughter or tremble with fear. The sultans who once commanded armies spanning 3 continents found their greatest challenge not in conquering distant lands, but in managing the delicate balance between absolute power and the human need for honest reflection that only humor could provide. They surrounded themselves with professional comedians not from frivolity, but from wisdom, understanding that laughter was perhaps the only force powerful enough to pierce through the dangerous isolation of supreme authority. Those ornate dining halls, now silent and empty, once served as theaters where the fate of empires hung on the perfect delivery of a single joke. The court jesters who performed there weren't simply entertainers. They were the conscience of an empire, speaking truths that no advisor dared whisper, and providing psychological medicine that no physician could prescribe. Their legacy lives on in every coffee house storyteller, every television comedian, every performer who uses humor to help people